Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB. Last episode, the Astral Claws, after having received an impertinent assault by Orc raiders upon their home system, launched an ill-advised assault on the Orcs' own base. This in spite of Rovik Blake, the chapter master of the Astral Claws, having himself declared that no Warder's chapter was to enter the Maelstrom Warpstorm Zone. This was a decree issued with good reason. After the loss of the Executioner's chapter, the Warders were spread thin, and a big defeat might be too much for the Warders to recover from. But the Astral Claws were a proud chapter, always had been, always would be. And so Rovik chose to disregard his own orders, and in doing so, invited disaster onto the Astral Claws. The Orc warboss proved far more resourceful than they had anticipated, and after bogging down the Astral Claws boarding parties on their rock base, the warlord struck with overwhelming numbers and slew Rovik Blake in single combat. The Astral Claws may never have recovered from the casualties they may have suffered that day, were it not for the actions of the commander of the 3rd Company of the Astral Claws, who organized a speedy and efficient retreat from the Orcs' home territory and saved the rest of the chapter. After having returned to safe space, the Astral Claws then held a conclave to elect their next chapter master. And with the recent events painfully fresh in the memory, the natural choice fell upon the captain of the 3rd Company, Huron. He was to be the youngest man ever appointed to the position of chapter master in the Astral Claws history. And as befit a new, young, and dynamic leader, he had some radical ideas about how the Astral Claws and the Warders chapters in general should conduct themselves in the Maelstrom adjacent resource extraction grid, and he did not hesitate a moment to put in place his new agenda. First and foremost, his predecessor's perceived passive position was immediately discarded in favor of a more proactive approach to the safety of the resource extraction grid. To this aim, the new chapter master's first action was to completely reorganize the Astral Claws from top to bottom, and also to change their deployment across the entirety of the resource extraction grid. He would also, in due time, change the placements of the other Warders chapters as well. And key in this part of the plan was the acquisition of large quantities of Exterminator's grade weaponry and munitions. Huron had seen his predecessor try and fail to defend everything. He was not about to make the same mistake. As we have talked about previously, the resource extraction grid, the autonomous zone, was vast, much bigger than most Imperial sectors, due in large part to its status as an autonomous zone and therefore technically not a part of the Imperium of Man. This classification comes with plentiful administrative benefits for the Imperium as a whole, but the sheer unimaginable mind-numbing size of it makes it nearly impossible to defend. There are hundreds of planets scattered across huge interstellar distances, where it can take months for a ship to go from one to the other. And if a planet is raided and the nearest source of reinforcements is a month or more away, they might as well be a millennia away for all the good it's going to do the planet currently being invaded. Under Rovik Blake, the Warders chapters attempted to fix this problem, first by establishing a solid control over a handful of systems, and then launching assaults into the Maelstrom Warp Zone itself, destroying the enemy before they had an opportunity to gather and launch their raids into the Autonomous Zone. But after the loss of the Executioner's chapter, this tactic was put on hold. And for 30 years, Rovic Blake fought a losing battle. He tried to stem an irresistible tide. He would hunt down 2, 3, 4, 5 pirate fleets, only to see the 6th slip through and burn a system. Then he would stop the next 5, only to see a 6th and a 7th leak through, because his fleets were too far out of position. The Warder's chapters were run ragged, up and down the autonomous zone, rushing back and forth, putting out fires, intercepting fleets, and cutting off lines of retreat and advancements, and there simply weren't enough of them. Huron had seen 3 decades of this slowly unraveling strategy, and was determined to not continue the mistake. The solution he proposed was a scorched planet policy, where the astral claws would destroy several planets on the periphery of the autonomous zone, along the lines of advance most often used by the raiders and the corsairs. At first, the logic may seem baffling. Surely ships traveling through the warp has no needs of planets in real space, right? Surely they would simply just head to their destinations. Easy peasy. Well, the warp is not quite so forgiving. The Maelstrom warp storm is, as mentioned, relatively stable, but navigational hazards abound in the autonomous zone. There are only so many stable warp routes that lead out of the Maelstrom and deeper into the autonomous Imperial space. In other words, if a Corsair fleet wishes to reach a populated target worthy of their attention, they only have so many avenues of approach available to them. Furthermore, these ships are required to spend months upon months upon months in the void just to reach their target. Say, for example, that a fleet of particularly ambitious corsairs have marked themselves out a rich planet deep within the relative safety of the autonomous zone, a planet that hasn't been raided, ravaged, and burned a dozen times already, and therefore overflowing with rich bounty. It could take 6 months or more to reach it. 6 months of warp travel. To take a nice and easy example, the average human being, assuming human raiders, will require something along the lines of 600 grams of food each and every day to stay healthy and in fighting shape. That's 18 kilograms of food for one person for 1 month, 108 kilograms for a 6-month trip, assuming that once they arrive, they'll have enough time to loot, pillage, and plunder to bring aboard the necessary supplies for the round trip. For the Americans amongst us, that's 238 pounds of food for one single combatant. Now, if they are indeed trying to raid one of the more peaceful back area worlds, they're probably going to require a relatively large force. Let's be conservative and say they're launching a lightning-fast strike against a pre-planned target, only perhaps 2,000 men, enough to overwhelm local PDF garrison forces, or at the very least lock down an area for long enough to smash and grab whatever it is they want. That then tallies up to some 216,000 kilograms, or 476,198 pounds. In food alone, mind you, before we get into the issues of ammunitions, of spare parts, of air, of water, of all of the myriad other things that a raiding force would undoubtedly need to launch an attack against a planet. A planet, mind you, undoubtedly used at this point to unwelcome visitors. And let's not even get into all of the other things. Heavy weapons, mortars, bolters, tanks, aircraft, transports, fuel. You get the gist. Any such raid is going to require huge quantities of supplies. This naturally imposes pretty harsh restrictions on a piratical fleet's area of operations. They can only raid a planet if they can carry enough supplies to reach that planet. And considering most of the vessels they have available to them are smaller, lighter craft, jury-rigged and hastily converted into makeshift warships, the transport capacity of many of these are going to be highly limited. This in turn means meagre pickings, fleets only being able to strike the same target over and over again. There's only so many times you can burn down a farmhouse until there's nothing of value to grab anymore. It also makes it far easier for the Imperials to predict where the enemy might arrive, leading to a short, and most of the time exceedingly one-sided engagement. An engagement that most pirates, who hold their lives dearly, would like to avoid. And just like the warders were trying to figure out how to defend such a large area, the pirates were trying to figure out how to get around their problems as well. Many more entrepreneuring captains came up with the idea of creating supply caches, ammo dumps, and pre-planned food storage areas close to their routes of travel, allowing their fleets to deviate, maybe only for a couple of weeks, to pick up fresh supplies and continue on towards the target. This would allow a fleet to expend all of its perishable and non-recyclable resources, because a lot of this can be reused, water and air for example, though considering the rickety nature of many of these slapped-together ships, you probably want a reserve of that as well. But in theory, a ship that could only carry enough supplies for 3 months of warp travel could use that time to reach the supply dump, refuel, rearm, resupply, and then travel for another 3 months, effectively doubling its area of operations. And there were even those that might go further still. The most ambitious of pirate kings might even create small de facto colonies on life-sustaining planets way outside of the usual routes of travel and patrol. There are, as mentioned, hundreds of Imperial worlds within the Autonomous Zone, but there are hundreds upon hundreds more that can sustain life, but are simply not worth colonizing. It is a massive and expensive effort to establish a firm and permanent foothold on a world. It requires a great deal of time, resources, and a permanent crew along with defenses. Much cheaper to simply send an extraction fleet who can sit by in orbit whilst mass earth movers and diggers extract all of the resources the fleet can carry and then head back to the Forge World. For the ruffians coming out of the Maelstrom, however, much of this is simply not a problem. A couple thousand individuals with up-to-date equipment can easily create some farmable land, some mines to extract resources to fuel a small-scale industry. And voila, you have a tiny little colony that is producing food, ammunition, resources, spare parts, whatever the raiding fleet might require, while still remaining so very infinitesimally tiny as to be virtually impossible to detect, even should a fleet come actively looking for the settlement. And hey, it's not like the warders can spare a fully functional warship to scan every square inch of a ball of dirt way outside of the usual trade lanes anyway. Even if they could, okay, you find one supply dump, you find one colony, and you bomb it. 5 weeks later, there's another one just like it in its place. And that's where Huron's scorched planet policy comes into play. The pirates can rebuild any number of supply bases, but they're going to be awfully hard-pressed to rebuild the planet. In this way, Huron could once again begin to limit the area of operation of the enemy's fleet. They could now once more not rely on supply caches. They could not rely on factories en route. They had to pick and choose their paths once more in relation to their own logistical capacity, which narrowed the areas that the warders would have to patrol. But there was another hurdle to be overcome first. Exterminator's grade weaponry is quite rare. Still, in an autonomous zone like the resource extraction grid, and with the authority of several Space Marine chapters, it was not overly difficult to acquire. The delivery methods, however, that was the big problem. Space-faring warships with the ability to deploy Exterminator's grade weaponry, those are few and far between. To further complicate matters, the destruction of a planet is no easy task, and requires a concentrated pinpoint barrage from multiple of these huge warships. The warders were already stretched far too thin. They certainly could not spare half a dozen ships to destroy a planet, and then spend another 3 months in the warp to destroy the next one, and then another 3 months to destroy the next one, and so on. The warders would have to dispatch a considerable portion of their void capacity to initiate Huron's plan, and even then, it would take a year or more to get real results. And if the Orc raid on the Astral Claw's home territory of the BADAB sector was any indication, the warders would be lucky if they had months, certainly not a year, and definitely not one at decreased capacity. The only possible solution, then, was for the warders to increase their own numbers. The simplest way to do so would be to receive reinforcements in the form of another fleet-based chapter to replace the Charnel Guard. But Rovik Blake had spent 3 decades barking up that particular tree and received nothing in return except for a gentle golden stream produced by a laughing inquisitorial bird high up in the Administratum's branches. So then what? Expand the Astral Claw's own naval capacity? Well, that is not as easy as it sounds. First and foremost, every single Astartes warship is a highly specialized work of de facto industrial art, labored over lovingly by the most expert adepts of the Mechanicus for decades at a time. The creation of even a single battle barge is a massive labor, a strike cruiser hardly any less so, and supply can hardly ever keep up with demand. This means that even chapters who are simply just lobbying for replacement warships could quickly find themselves on a waiting list many years long, and even that only after extensive lobbying efforts. But of course, the warders were not asking for ships that they had already lost to be restored to them. They were asking for a general increase in their own naval capacity. And that was not going to happen. First and foremost, because the warders did not have all that many friends in high places right now. But more importantly, because the Adeptus Administratum takes an exceedingly dim view to Space Marine chapters expanding their naval prowess without a supremely good reason. For the simple fact that a chapter of the God Emperor's Angels of Death is already a nearly unrivaled fighting force with both power-armored boots planted on terra firma. A single chapter of 1,000 battle brothers is more than the equal of the entire armies of the Imperial Guard. And as we saw during the siege of Vrax, even just a few small war bands of traitor marines can extend a war for several years. But in the Void, whilst a battle barge and a strike cruiser is, again, massively overarmed and armoured in comparison to its tonnage, and its cargo of space marines is no less lethal in the Void, the Imperial Navy possesses many warships of considerably greater armament and armor than any Space Marine battle barge, and the Navy possesses a lot more of them. Make of that what you will, suffice to say, the Adeptus Administratum takes a very dim view to a Space Marine chapter expanding beyond its initial allotment of ships. So what to do then? If the Warders could not receive new ships from the Imperium, they certainly couldn't build them themselves, and a replacement chapter for the Executioners was as forlorn a hope as ever. What to do? It would appear that Luft Huron's ambitious plan would not survive contact with the Imperial bureaucracy. But Huron was not so naive to have ever thought that the ships he required would come from outside of the autonomous zone. For in reality, there were dozens upon dozens of ships just sitting there, well within Luft Huron's reach and authority. The prize vessels claimed from pirates, corsairs, raiders, and other ne'er-do-well that had plagued the autonomous zone for the last few decades. In raw numbers alone, there were enough ships there to double, triple, and quadruple the Warder's current fleet. Of course, it wasn't all quite that easy. First and foremost, prize ships were handed over to the Imperial Navy as a matter of course, not kept by the chapters of the Astartes. Secondly, most of these vessels were de facto useless. The overwhelming majority of prizes— by the way, if you are unaware, a prize vessel is simply a ship that has been seized from an enemy faction and is then given the designation of prize ship. Most of them are salvaged, ripped apart with anything and everything valuable being taken off and used for other purposes. Guns, auger stations, electronical components, copper wiring, hell, even the metal from the hull can be reused for other purposes. Some vessels are so far away from Imperial standard as to be completely hopeless to refit or utilize in any way beyond clean scrap metal, as is the case with Orc kill cruisers or their attack ships. No amount of work or refit will ever turn that into an Imperial starship again. Many other ships utilized by the great enemy, chaos or traitors or other forms of heretics, these ships are often annihilated outright, so as to not risk any lingering taint in the vessel itself. You might think it overly paranoid, after all. If the ship is going to be reduced to scrap metal, surely that can't be so corrupting, can it? You'd be surprised, and the Imperium tends to not take any chances when it comes to chaos corruption. And of course, many of the ships will simply just be unfit for military service in any capacity. As a very rough breakdown, let's take 10 ships. 5 of them will be completely useless for anything more than scrap metal, or will be annihilated outright. Another 4 would usually have been resigned to scrap, but with extensive refitting, rearmament, and upgrades could be turned into system patrol boats or 3rd or 4th line patrol craft. Normally, again, this would require far too much effort, and they would simply just be scrapped. But in the current situation, Huron had better needs for them, and the 10th, the final vessel, might just be something worthy of frontline service. Say, for example, a pirate lord managed to seize control over an Imperial warship, a light cruiser, a few frigates, a destroyer here and there. They're going to require a fair bit of refurbishment, repairs, and maybe the occasional refit, but many of these ships can still be returned to frontline service. Now, 1 in 10 doesn't sound like particularly good odds, and I'd agree with you, but the 4 ships that can be returned to service with extensive refits, they don't need to be frontline vessels. What the warders truly need is not more battle barges or strike cruisers. What they need is system defense craft, gunboats and light patrol vessels to free the battle barges and the strike cruisers from having to conduct those operations themselves. And Huron's proposed plan to drum up the prize ships to do just that could be the solution to oh so many problems. There was one final technical hurdle, in that these prize ships did not belong to the Astral Clause, or the Warders chapters in general, and that Space Marines are not technically allowed to operate non-Astartes vessels. But I am sure Huron would be swift to remind anyone raising such points that this is an autonomous zone, and if they can't get resources from the Imperium to protect it, because it's an autonomous zone and therefore none of the Imperium's business, then surely the Astral Claws are equally free to do whatever the hell they want. And within a year, Huron's radical program of refitting and rearming several of these smaller ships had succeeded in freeing up strike cruisers and battle barges to go out into the fringes of the autonomous zone and commence his Scorched Planet program. Within a year, enough of these improvised vessels had been created to free the battle barges and strike cruisers, and whilst many had questioned the legality of Huron's plans, many had questioned the efficacy of his plans, and many had questioned if they could even be carried out in the first place. But when it was all set in motion, after a year, none could doubt the effectiveness of it. Even with the introduction of a mere handful of these new auxiliary craft, valuable warders' resources were freed up from patrol and defense duty, and able to adopt a far more aggressive posture against the enemy, instead of being stuck in endless patrol duty up and down the warplanes, hoping to come to the aid of a vessel already under attack. The warders could now dispatch frigates and light ships to actively hunt the enemy, destroying them before they assaulted a ship. The warders and their attached Imperial Navy elements could, in other words, return to a version in miniature of Rovik Blake's Scourge campaign, where they tried to discover, interrupt, and intercept the enemy instead of merely protecting themselves against them. After decades of a slow, exsanguinating death by 1,000 tiny little cuts, this radical change in the Warders' strategy brought renewed fervor and morale to the Warders' chapters. They felt that finally they were doing something again. They were taking the war to the enemy. And whilst initially there had been many grumbling about this plan, their dissenting voices were swiftly silenced by a general outpouring of optimism and support. And as the warders more and more became able to aggress upon the foe, more and more prize vessels were captured. Undoubtedly, the warders' chapters also began taking extra care in capturing promising ships, as the size of the warders' navy grew exponentially. Until finally, at the end of the first year of Huron's new policy, the Warders chapters found themselves with strength to spare. For the first time since arriving in the autonomous zone, they had a surplus of warships. And as the man responsible for all of this seemingly miraculous turnaround, Luft Huron was riding high on a wave of enthusiasm and support. The man himself was already looking towards the future, to yet grander goals and paths as of yet unexplored. But the securing of the autonomous zone was but the first step on Huron's lengthy road of ambition, and the next stride would make the controversy of seizing prize vessels look like a most minor thing indeed. For in the Astral Claw's home system, upon the principal world and capital of BADAB Prime, events were beginning to come to a boil. Events that would see Luft Huron take his ambitions to an entirely new level. But that is going to have to wait until next time. Until then, I have been Arch, thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. As usual, if you liked the video, please do consider leaving a like, a comment, and subscribing to the channel, and maybe even sharing it around as well. Have a good day.